In Chapter 2, we're going to switch gears a little bit and we're going to start talking about some geometry topics. So in this lesson, you are going to name corresponding angles and corresponding sides of congruent figures, and we'll talk about what congruent means. You'll also be able to identify different congruent figures as well. First of all, figures that have the same size and the same shape are called congruent figures. Make sure that you are filling in any blanks that are missing on your notes, such as the congruent figures here. If you look over at the diagram in your notes, it says the matching angles are called corresponding angles. Angle B corresponds with angle E, meaning it's in the same location as in the congruent triangle. B and D would not be corresponding because they're in different locations of the triangle and they are not the same size. Now we also have corresponding sides. So corresponding sides are going to have the same length and they're going to be on matching sides. Let's do an example where we're going to name congruent parts. So both of these figures are congruent, and we're going to name all of the corresponding angles and corresponding sides. I'm going to start off with labeling or naming the corresponding angles, because the corresponding sides, it's really important that we give the corresponding sides according to the corresponding angles. So let's start off there. If I look at angle G right here in this top triangle, which angle would match or would be corresponding to that? And hopefully you're able to see that the Q down here would be the matching or corresponding angle. And the way that we write that is angle G is congruent to angle Q. And then we'd go through and list all of the different angles that are congruent. So I'm going to move on to angle H, and I would notice that angle H is in the same location or corresponding spot as angle R. And then my last one, I would have angle F is corresponding or congruent to angle P. When we have corresponding angles, then those angles are also congruent to each other. So when they're in the same spot, if the triangles are congruent, that means that the angles are congruent. Same would be true with sides. If we have two congruent triangles or more than two congruent triangles, whatever the corresponding sides are, those are going to be congruent to each other as well. So when we're labeling things, say if I look at this top triangle and I want to label FG, when I label it, I'm going to write a little line above it to signify that it's a line. I'm going to use my congruent symbol. So the congruent symbol is just an equal sign with a little squiggly on top. And when I match it with the other triangle, I need to pay attention and say, okay, well, F corresponded and was congruent to P. So that's what I need to say first, since I started off with F in my side. And then G is corresponding and congruent to Q. So I need to make sure that I go FG is congruent to PQ. Order matters, so it's really important that we pay attention to how we are saying the different sides and the angles with this. So my next side that I'm going to do is GH, and again I have to be very careful when I list that congruent side with it as well. In the next triangle, so I went GH, I've got to go QR in order to list my corresponding or my congruent side. Why don't you pause the video, see if you can list correctly the last side. So my last side, I could do either HF or FH. Doesn't matter which, but it does matter in your other order. It depends on which way you do. So if you go FH, and right now I'm going to go HF, yours is just going to be reverse of mine. So it's very important that we pay attention to that. So mine is H to F, so yours is going to be R to P. or the other one I should say is R to P. And if you have the first one reversed, then you'd have the second one reversed as well. The next thing that we're going to do is identify congruent figures. So two figures are congruent when corresponding angles and corresponding sides are congruent. So we have this example down at the bottom where triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Now in this example, the way that we shorthand write that is with a little triangle and then ABC. We use our congruent symbol and then triangle DEF. Now if you look at this image, when we're given images and we're trying to decide if it is congruent to each other, or maybe we are identifying congruency and we give markings, we can identify whether something is congruent or not by markings. For example, if you look at angle A, it has 3 lines, and so does angle D. They're in corresponding spots, so that means that they are in the matching spots, and then because of the 3 lines, that is an indication that those are also congruent to each other. So they're corresponding congruent parts. B is congruent to E, because they each have 1 line, and C, angle C is congruent to angle F because they each have 2 lines. Same with the sides. Side AB is corresponding and congruent to side DE. We know that they're corresponding because they're on the same side, same location. We know they're congruent because of the marking. BC is congruent to EF, and AC is congruent to DF. When we are naming or writing that something is congruent, we have to be careful in our order. Notice it goes ABC, so the one with the 3 marks to the 1 mark to the 2 marks. We have to do the same thing when we're labeling the other triangle. 3 marks, 1 mark, 2 mark. So it has to match up with the corresponding angles, and also it matches up with corresponding sides. When you are trying to figure out if two figures are congruent, you need to make sure that the corresponding angles are congruent to each other and that corresponding sides are congruent to each other. If I look at this, I would notice, okay, well, I have this 5 here and this 5 here, and those are corresponding, and again across from it, and I could even notice my angles are corresponding and congruent here. But then hopefully I notice that this corresponding side with this one is not the same. So it's supposed to be in the same spot, it's supposed to be the same length, but it is not the same length. One is a length of 2, one is a length of 3. So they are not congruent figures because the corresponding sides are not the same. So no. Okay, so again, no, they are not congruent figures because the corresponding sides are not equal. For example, 2 is not equal to 3. Now we are given 2 triangles are congruent. So again, it says triangle ABC and triangle DEF are congruent. What is the side length of EF? If these are congruent, then that means their corresponding sides should be equal or the same. If I have EF over here, EF is corresponding to BC. Hopefully you were able to notice that before I said it. So if our EF is corresponding and they are congruent, then if BC is 8 meters, then that means EF must be 8 meters as well, because BC is congruent to EF. What is the perimeter of DEF? And I should probably have a little triangle right there, so triangle DEF. Again, if I'm thinking about those corresponding sides, we already figured out that this one was 8 meters. If we have the opposite side here, so this DE, it would also be congruent to AB, which would be 8 meters as well. And then AC is congruent to DF, so that one should be 3 meters. Now the word perimeter means to add up all of the sides, and it gives us our total distance around, in this case, the triangle. So we go 8 plus 3, so 16 plus 3 gives us 19 meters. Our last example here, why don't you pause the video if you think you're confident and see if you can answer these two questions about these two polygons. Okay, so it says these two polygons are congruent to each other. What is the length of XW? So when I'm looking at these two triangles, I look at XW and I try to find the corresponding side on the other polygon. So I have BC would be corresponding with that, and since BC is 4 meters long, that means that XY is also 4 meters long, because like I said, BC is congruent to XY. What is the measure of angle W? Just like sides when they're congruent, if we have two congruent polygons and the sides are corresponding, those are congruent, the angles are as well. So let's find angle W. Angle W is down here. We have our corresponding angle to W, hopefully you are able to find, would be A. So A says that it's 70 degrees, so that means W must also be 70 degrees. So the measure of angle W equals 70 degrees, because angle W is congruent to angle A. Don't forget to do your summary, making sure that you write 2 to 3 complete sentences on identifying corresponding sides and angles and deciding if two polygons are congruent. And also your question is at the bottom as well.